Declaro abierta
The 9th meeting of the 62nd session of the Commission for Social Development is called to order. Item 3A, priority theme, fostering social development and social justice through social policies to accelerate progress on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to achieve the overarching goal of poverty eradication. I invite the Commission to continue its consideration of Agenda Item 3A entitled Priority Theme, Fostering Social Development and Social Justice through Social Policies to Accelerate Progress on Implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to achieve the overarching goal of poverty eradication in order to hold a multi-stakeholder forum on the priority theme entitled Good Practices and Innovative Solutions in Promoting Social Development and Social Justice. I am pleased to welcome the distinguished panelists for our multi-stakeholder forum this afternoon. His Excellency Danilo Turk, President of the Club de Madrid and former President of the Republic of Slovenia, Mr. Doug O'Brien, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Cooperative Business Council, CLUSA International, Ms. Ifio Fong, National Coordinator of Women in Development and Environment, Worldwide Network, Nigeria, Ms. Kathy Feingold, Deputy President of the International Trade Union Confederation, and Ms. Shia Gopal, Special Representative to the United Nations for the International Organization of Employers. I'm also pleased to welcome the moderator, Ms. Jean Quinn, Chair of the NGO Committee on Social Development. Before I hand over to the moderator, I wish to remind panelists to keep within their allocated time limit of 10 minutes and delegations to keep within the 3-minute time limit during the interactive discussion. I thank participants for their understanding. Ms. Quinn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A warm welcome to you all, and we appreciate your presence here with us this afternoon. Social justice is the foundation for inclusion and cuts through all sectors by drawing attention to the systemic barriers and societal biases based on race, gender, disability, socioeconomic status, and other factors that lead to inequality in income, opportunities, and influences. Ensuring social justice and inclusion becomes even more central in times when multiple and overlapping crises are looming and many countries are unprepared to face the imminent challenge of climate change, population, aging, and digitalization. Governments alone cannot meet the challenges of today's fast-changing world. To promote a trajectory of inclusive and equitable growth and build resilient societies, partnerships and cooperation among all stakeholders are essential and needed. For any policy to be successful, broad consultations with key stakeholders from the stages of design to implementation and follow-up really is very critical. Today, we will hear from diverse actors who will highlight the work they do, including with governments, to ensure that social development and social justice are promoted and that no one is left behind. Through this panel discussion, we hope this afternoon to identify solutions, good practices, and innovative approaches for fostering inclusive social development and social justice that accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda with a long-lasting impact. Before we begin our presentation, I would kindly ask all of our panelists to keep their statements or presentations to 10 minutes, and I count on your cooperation this afternoon. It is my great pleasure to invite our first panelist this afternoon, Ms. Kathy Feingold, Deputy President, International Trade Union Confederation. Kathy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair. It is an honor to be here with all of you today. My name is Kathy Feingold, and I'm representing the International Trade Union Confederation. We are the organization that represents over 200 million unionized workers around the world. And today I want to talk about what roles trade union partners can play in innovating and implementing practical creative solutions to improving the working conditions of domestic, migrant, and informal economy workers. The first thing that's very important is we, as a global labor movement, demand a new social contract. We need to make sure that no one is left behind and that governments must urgently move towards a new social contract based on rights, equality, and decent work. Our new social contract is constructed around 6 pillars, placing the world of work at the center of socio-economic development. The most important, jobs. Governments must strive to achieve full employment and decent work by investing in quality, climate-friendly jobs, and taking measures to formalize the informal economy. We need rights. Governments and employers must ensure compliance with fundamental labor rights as enshrined in the ILO labor standards, including freedom of association, collective bargaining, non-discrimination, equal pay, occupational health and safety, just to name a few. These rights need to apply to all workers, irrespective of their employment arrangements or migration status. We need minimum living wages as part of our new social contract. Governments must ensure minimum living wages to allow workers a floor of dignity. Just wages also mean equal pay for work of equal value between women and men, national and migrant workers. Our fourth part of our new social contract is social protection. That is the floor that workers need to stand on. Governments must ensure universal, rights-based, and gender-responsive social protection systems, as well as vital public services, including healthcare and education. This requires strengthened financing at national and international levels. We need equality as part of our new social contract. Governments must work to address inequalities within societies, and this implies implementation of anti-discrimination legislation, addressing gender biases in laws and policies, and ensuring a world of work free of gender-based violence and harassment in line with the International Labor Organization's Convention 190. And finally, among all of these pieces, we need inclusion. Governments must ensure democratic governance processes and social dialogue with workers, having a say in decisions that affect them, from just transition energy policies to transition with new forms of technology. On the informal economy, high informality is a major driver of inequalities, and many migrants and domestic workers are informally employed. In low and middle income countries, the rates of informal employment are higher, also among women than men. To improve the working living conditions of workers in the informal economy, we need to close regulatory gaps, and we need robust monitoring systems. This includes cracking down on employment misclassification, which is rampant around the world. And we need to ensure that employers take responsibility for their working relationships and reduce barriers and put in place incentives for informal workers to formalize their activities. Trade unions around the world call for 1 billion informal workers, representing half of the informal economy, to be formalized by 2030, and that they have been at the forefront of initiatives both to formalize informal jobs and to close decent work deficits in the informal economy. In Peru, the Confederation of Workers, CATP, has been running information campaign for workers from Venezuela who are arriving to regularize their status and advocate for their access to formal jobs. Similar work is being carried out by unions in Europe for undocumented migrants, for example, in France and Belgium, and here in the United States, unions are opening up their halls to talk to migrant workers about their rights and protections. Statutory minimum wage increases have been shown to have a positive effect on the livelihoods of informal workers as well. We need to increase the minimum wage so we can increase the attractiveness of the formal labor market, which will provide a powerful incentive to formalize. As such, we, on the one hand, negotiate for minimum living wages, and on the other, we need to work to ensure that no categories of workers are excluded. This is particularly important for domestic workers, agricultural workers, migrant workers, who are often left out of relevant national laws, including those here in the United States. Transparent and non-discriminatory mechanisms for mutual recognition of skills and qualifications in countries of origin and destination are also important for migrants' access to formal jobs. Unions across many regions establish partnerships with civil society, vocational training institutes, and consulates to help migrant workers and refugees access training opportunities and support with the recognition of qualifications. That's happening right here in New York City as we sit here. Trade unions also work to strengthen national social protection systems with a view to ensure universal coverage. Social protection floors in particular are essential in order to provide basic guarantee of income security for all workers, irrespective of their employment status or contribution history, which is not only key for employment formalization, but for reducing inequalities. Social protection financing efforts must be fair through progressive forms of taxation, cracking down on tax evasion and ensuring that employers pay their fair share of contributions. On migrant workers in particular, we are calling for rights-based migration governance frameworks built and implemented through genuine social dialogue, putting unions, migrant workers, government representatives, and employers all around a table to come up with solutions. We need to advocate for freedom of association and protection for migrant workers who seek justice against exploitation and other work-related abuses. We organize migrant workers to improve their working conditions through collective bargaining. Through information centers and counseling services, hiring halls, trade unions help migrants, including would-be migrants, to navigate complex migration and recruitment procedures and raise awareness on fair recruitment practices. We also provide legal aid for accessing remedies in case of human and labor rights violation and organize vocational and language trainings to support migrant workers and refugees' inclusion into the labor market. For example, my own union federation here in the United States, the AFL-CIO, has been conducting trainings to equip unions to help protect migrant workers when they take action to enforce labor laws. As a result, a growing number of migrant workers have secured status protections and work authorization by organizing with their coworkers and their unions to help make their workplaces safer. The effective use of the protections by trade unions alongside migrant workers results in migrant workers being less vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and harm on the job, and raises the working standards not only for migrants, but for all workers. And here in the United States, we spend 12 times the amount on immigration enforcement than we do on labor enforcement. Imagine if we spent those resources to improve working conditions for all workers instead of cracking down on immigration. Finally, we need universal rights-based agenda. I started with our demand for a new social contract, SDG 8, with its targets on employment, workers' rights, decent work, social protection, inclusive growth, and environmental preservation is a cornerstone to this. This vision requires that a rights-based universal agenda, nowadays enshrined by the SDGs, remains the basis for multilateralism for democracy worldwide. And for all of this, we need to have workers at the table in all decisions concerning them and in implementation processes. This hinges upon ensuring freedom of association and collective voice for all workers. We need to make sure no worker is left behind. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Feingold, for that contribution and the beginning of the session this afternoon. I was very struck by your call for a new social contract based on rights, equality and decent work, and how it's built around the 6 pillars which you just talked about. I was also very interested in your recognition of the fact that 1 billion informal workers represent half of the informal economy to be formalised by 2030, and we have less than 6 years to do that. An interesting piece of data. And then the whole area of strengthening national social protection systems with a view to universal coverage. And also the social protection financing efforts must be fair through progressive forms of taxation. And I think that was really very important that you pointed out to us. And perhaps the thing that has struck me the most, Ms. Feingold, was your call for a rights-based universal agenda. And so how we need the workers around the table. Everybody is needed to be in this conversation. And I think that's really important to keep in mind in this conversation this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our next panellist, Mr. Danilo Turk, President of Club de Madrid and former President of Slovenia. You have the floor, Mr. Turk.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And let me start by saying that currently I am in New York and participating in this panel in my capacity as president of Club de Madrid, which is an organization of former democratically elected presidents and prime ministers. There are several organizations involving former presidents and prime ministers. Club de Madrid, with its 125 members from 71 countries from all regions of the world, is the largest among them. Now, we have discussed in Club de Madrid a number of initiatives in the past years, and one of them, which we believe was among the most important initiatives, was the initiative for convening of the second World Summit for Social Development. We have agreed to put this very high on our list of priorities, partly because some of us have participated in the preparations of the first summit 30 years ago. Obviously, many among those who have participated were then in a different status. I myself was at that time permanent representative of Slovenia in New York to the United Nations, and we have participated in the preparatory negotiations in the years 93, 94, and at the summit itself. It was an important experience because it showed how at a particular moment in history it becomes possible to articulate a coherent vision for future development and make that coherent vision a matter of consensus. Now, the 1990s were a better time than times in which we live today. But still, the inspiration and importance of the first summit should be kept in mind, and it should be understood that much that has happened subsequently, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015, owe a great deal to what was agreed to in 1995. I think it is important to keep this in mind in order to have a sufficiently bold idea for the future and a sufficiently high level of ambition for the next Summit for Social Development, which will take place in 2025, that is 30 years after the first Social Summit. Here, of course, we are discussing, in our panel today, we are discussing certain aspects of this question: good practices, innovative solutions, promoting social development. And I'm particularly pleased to have the opportunity to speak after Kathy Feingold, because she gave us a very cogent list of priorities, important elements for the future social development and for any kind of pronunciation that claims to be a kind of a pact for the future or pact for social development in the future. The problems that she referred to are daunting. 60% of employment in many countries, perhaps most countries, is informal. How does one bring that into formal sector remains very unclear, and it would be very important to spare no effort in the years that remain to give this task a sufficiently high priority status. She also mentioned the need to develop a rights-based agenda. Now, let us think about the rights-based agenda as a problem. UN and the international community in general have plenty of experience with discussion on human rights. But are these discussions adequate? Do we have an adequate approach to human rights? Or should we really think very carefully before we introduce human rights element into social policy discussion? I myself have worked 40 years ago as a rapporteur of the United Nations on implementation of economic, social, and cultural rights. That was at the time of the ending of the Cold War, and it was hoped at that time that economic, social, and cultural rights will gain greater prominence, that they will be taken more seriously, and that as a result we shall come back to the historic balance of human rights which is reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. That balance was sadly abandoned in the subsequent developments, and much focus was on civil and political rights, and in particular on violation of rights. Not enough energy was invested on the question of balance between both sets of rights, and even less energy was devoted to the question of how does one improve cooperation, not punitive approaches to human rights violations, but rather cooperation that makes human rights more adequately implemented. Now, these are very important fundamental questions which we must not avoid, which we must not shy away from in this period when we are preparing for the second World Summit for Social Development. We have to look for positive examples that give human rights adequate meaning, real meaning, that improve human condition. And such examples exist. And I hope that much of that will be discussed this afternoon. What comes to mind immediately as an example of such positive alternative approach is the Brazilian policy of Bolsa Familia, which we are all familiar with in some basic elements. That is, helping families to invest in education of children, make them better prepared for adult life, for jobs, and as a result of that, improving the situation of large parts of population in the long term. Now, Bolsa Familia and similar formulae have been in place for decades now. And it would be very important now to look into this kind of practical experience in order to figure out how does one approach the question of social development generally? What does one think when one says human rights-based approach? What really helps improvement and implementation of human rights in full? Let us not forget the Universal Declaration of Human Rights contains an article, Article 28, which says everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which all human rights can be fully realized. Social order and international order. That's already enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself. So why don't we think about this more creatively and more imaginatively now, and figuring out if we can together develop a better balance in approaching human rights as a need for people everywhere in the world. How do we abandon the punitive and also acrimonial aspects of human rights discourse that we have witnessed in the past decades and which we witness today again? I'm mentioning these examples because I believe that they are really fundamentally important. Of course, there are many practical ways in which questions of future social development can be answered. Fighting poverty clearly remains a basic objective, and the question of how does one measure progress in fighting poverty is a very practical matter. There was another panel on Monday in which I had the opportunity to participate, and we heard an excellent presentation about how that can be done. Of course, there are very practical things that must be done, and many of them are being done, and they should be taken full advantage of. And one could go on with a list of possible contributions of good practices which can help promoting social development more fully. Now, Madam Moderator, I know I did not contribute very much in terms of specific proposals that should be part of our discussions for the future, but I thought that this is a moment when we have to look at the basic needs of our time, basic needs for social development with a necessary level of critical thought, with an aim to address some of the fundamental problems and also to develop an appropriately high level of ambition. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Danilo Turk, for your interesting, as always, topic this afternoon, and the recognition of Club de Madrid's priority for the World Social Summit, as is, I guess, the priority for many of us moving into 2025. And I think you raised the question, and maybe it's a question we would look at this afternoon, is what is an adequate approach to human rights, and how do we view that? Also, if we're going to talk about breaking the cycle of poverty and homelessness, particularly within families, how do we invest in children? Because my belief is that that is where we break that cycle of poverty and homelessness. And I do think, like you said, the summit and the various summits that are still coming were summited out of it, but there are opportunities for communities to build, as you said, coherent narratives and an action plan that will serve all of us. So I think they're really important points that hopefully we will elaborate on this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Turk. And to my next panellist, Mr. Douglas O'Brien, President and CEO, National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you to the Commission for this opportunity to talk about how cooperatives are a best practice and an innovative solution in promoting social development. In my remarks today, I'd like to do four things briefly. And the first is to consider how cooperatives are indeed a best practice and a proven strategy to help people advance social development goals across the world. The second is to provide a couple specific examples of how people have used cooperatives. A third is to discuss the importance of a supportive public policy environment so more people can use cooperatives to advance their social development goals. And then finally, I do want to take a moment to highlight the fact that the General Assembly has proclaimed 2025 as an International Year of Cooperatives. I think very much in mind with the notion that cooperatives can be such an effective tool. I present to you a slide, a quote from a recent last year, a report from the Secretary General stating that guided by their values and principles, cooperatives can contribute to all dimensions of sustainable development. And I think this is an important point that cooperatives, they are a known type of entity, a business that people can come together and as defined by the International Cooperative Alliance, cooperatives are an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs through jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. Cooperatives have made a huge impact across the globe. In fact, today, approximately 12% of all humanity, more than 1 billion people, are members of cooperatives. There are 3 million cooperatives worldwide, providing 10% of the jobs across the world. Here in the United States, 1 out of every 3 people in the U.S. are a member of a cooperative, of a business that they own, that they control through a democratically elected board, and that benefits them directly. Just a moment about the organization that I work with, the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International. We are an association of cooperatives here in the United States, all types of cooperatives. We are also, and have for over 70 years, partnered with primarily the U.S. government through USAID and others to help others across the world in developing regions use cooperatives to create economic opportunity and to solve common problems. Today we have a portfolio of over $190 million, or 90 million US dollars, and we're working on 26 projects in 16 countries around the world. I want to talk about a couple of examples, get very concrete on what the cooperative approach can mean to people across the world. This is a group of women that we worked with in Guatemala who formed a recycling co-op, and you can see the SDGs that are directly impacted by this work. The Atitlan Recicla Cooperative empowered nearly 1,000 women from the Mayan communities in Guatemala. It provided them dignified employment and income for the indigenous women sanitary workers. So there was a major problem in the beautiful lake region in Guatemala around Lake Atitlan. because it's so beautiful, many people toured the area, and there became a problem with garbage and refuse. The women came together in a cooperative and gathered those materials that were recyclable and gained revenue from their households from sales of those revenues, and solved a serious environmental problem at the same time. A second example is from East Timor in the Timorese Coffee Cooperative. Cooperativa Café Timor was established nearly 30 years ago with just 450 coffee farmers. It now counts nearly 27,000 farmers in what is otherwise a very remote and an area that lacks critical services. Today, there are over 44,000 coffee-growing households participating in the cooperative. And the cooperative not only helps the farmers grow coffee and sell coffee and capture more of that value, it also has a network that has served more than 2 million people in healthcare. The cooperative understand that its members' needs went beyond just economic and went to a social development goal related to health. The cooperative, because it was people-centric and wanted to take care of the needs of the members, solved that problem. And today, the Cooperativa Café Timor provides critical access to international specialty markets with major international partners such as McCormick & Company and Starbucks. Now I'd like to talk a moment about how do cooperatives like these, and how can they occur? How can more people use cooperatives to solve these problems? A critical component is supporting enabling environments. That is, member states within the UN ensure that they have the policy environment so that people can access, create, and create thriving cooperatives. The Cooperative Law and Regulatory Initiative of the U.S. Overseas Cooperative Development Council, of which NCBA-CLUSA is a member, has created a tool called the Cooperative Law and Regulatory Initiative, also known as Clarity. This is a tool that people in countries, stakeholders in countries, can use to assess the regulatory and legislative environment within their country. And they assess it against the best practice of cooperatives and the 7 cooperative principles. For example, does the legislative environment allow and encourage democratic participation in the cooperative? Is the cooperative autonomous and independent from the government, which is another of the 7 cooperative principles? With experience that we've had at NCBA-CLUSA, many countries have been able to use this tool, and it in fact has changed the legislative environment in countries such as Kenya, the Dominican Republic, and Ecuador. And I'll just speak very briefly about, from the U.S. perspective, we have a number of sectors that are mature or at scale and have made transformational impact. For instance, in rural America, most of the electricity comes from utilities that are owned and controlled by people who live in rural America. These were created in the 1930s and 40s, most of them were, because people in rural places did not have access to electricity here in the United States. It wasn't until people in the rural United States established cooperatives and partnered with the federal government. The way that they established those cooperatives largely had to do with a policy environment that was supportive of those people. And now just a moment on how cooperatives can communicate the work that they do. There's a major bank here in the United States known as CoBank. It finances rural infrastructure, primarily agriculture and utilities. In their most recent sustainability report, they highlighted the sustainable development goals that their work supported. It included work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, disaster relief, advocacy and industry support, renewable energy portfolio, food access, among others. Now, I'd like to finish my remarks in talking about the 2025 International Year of the Cooperative. Just this last fall, the General Assembly passed a resolution that it would proclaim 2025 as the International Year of the Cooperative that would provide opportunities for continued partnership with UN to provide policy analysis and technical support and capacity building for cooperatives. And working together to support a better enabling environment, we believe that 2025 provides a unique opportunity to present the importance that cooperatives could have in forwarding the social development goals and empowering people from across the world. Madam Moderator, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about how cooperatives can help forward social development goals as a best practice and an innovative solution that's gone to scale.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. O'Brien. It's a most interesting presentation on cooperatives. And your stats are very significant in terms of 12% of humanity are members of 3 million cooperatives around the world. I think that's really significant in terms of where that whole area is going. And of course, the good news is that, and you proclaim, I love the word proclaim, that 2025 will be the year of cooperatives. And that's really going to support all you're doing and encourages all of us as well to promote what you're doing. I think what stood out for me actually was your vision to help more people use cooperatives to build a more inclusive economy around the world. And I know my father in days gone by was very much part of the agricultural area, and so we grew up with cooperatives. I think your experience and vision show how policies and partnerships with government can address these large-scale challenges in ways that are driven by the local stakeholders. I think that was really important, and we keep saying that all the time, the people that have the experience and the skills. Thank you for sharing the story of Guatemala and the women in Guatemala. I was really struck by pictorially how you showed us that about the whole area of recycling, but what they were doing for one of the most beautiful lakes in the world, and how significant that was for them. I'm very struck by the fact that it's a really value-led organisation, and that comes across in your presentation. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. O'Brien. It's now my great pleasure to call on Dr. Ife Offal, National Coordinator of Women in Development and Environment. Dr. Ife, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. So we all know that in 2015, the member states made commitments, while adopting the 2030 agenda for SDGs, that no one will be left behind, and that we will reach the furthest first. Now we have less than 6 years to go, and it's like the world is off course when it comes to achieving SDGs. Now, the main focus of my presentation is on homelessness. We do know that the issue of homelessness occurs in almost every region of the world. And the number of homeless people is still very controversial, but there's an estimate that about 216 million people are homeless, while 1.6 billion people live in unsafe and inadequate housing. Again, we also know that homelessness was not really mentioned in the SDGs. And, but we also know that, that we cannot achieve the SDGs without addressing the problem of homelessness. Now, up till now, we don't yet have an agreed definition of homelessness. But we have, a description that homelessness includes people who live on the streets, under the bridges, temporary accommodation, and all that and all that. So there are various factors which have been identified that are driving homelessness. Homelessness occurs amongst the men, the youth, and the women. However, my presentation is focusing on homelessness amongst women. And I'll be looking at the intersection between customary laws and norms and homelessness. Again, the interconnectivity between poverty and homelessness have been mentioned, particularly during this period in many side events that we have attended so far. However, I will also focus on the burden of governance, insecurity, conflict, and political crisis that has rendered millions homeless, particularly in Africa. Finally, I will touch on inclusive social policies and good practices and solutions to address homelessness and ensure that no woman anywhere is left behind. Now, the bulk of women in Africa suffer social exclusion. They are denied their right to inheritance, right to land and habitat, due to customary laws and norms. And this is happening despite all the UN resolutions, the CEDAW document, which we all know, and even the AU protocol, to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the right of women in Africa. Yes, the Maputo Protocol has brought some level of achievements to the African human rights agenda. However, the situation on ground is demanding more urgent action to guarantee women and girls their full enjoyment of their human rights. Now, in Africa, the right to land, housing, and property are part of the principal factors that determine economic and social well-being of most people in Africa. These rights are very critical to women's struggle to equality in gender relations and empowerment. As of today, those sections of the customary laws and norms that deny women their right to land, inheritance, and housing have not been repealed. And we don't even have community chiefs or village heads that have been arrested for, or penalized for this gender discrimination. So this is the area which we think that should be looked into, because women in Africa, and I believe in some other places too, do not own land. They don't have the right to land. In fact, the World Bank assessment in Africa found that less than 30% of women own land. Now, the second point here is poverty and homelessness. I will not talk much about it because a lot has been said, about the connection between poverty and homelessness. So I'll quickly go to the third factor that is driving homelessness in Africa and some other areas in the South, in the global South. The issue of insecurity is a major issue now. Conflict, wars, as well as the burden of governance. It has rendered many, many people homeless. According to the UNHCR 2023, about 4 million persons in sub-Saharan Africa are displaced from their homes. There are a few examples, like in DRC, we have over 6 million people. Then in South Sudan, nearly 4 million people that were forcibly replaced out of their homes. Now, other areas like Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Mozambique, you have millions of people that are displaced from their homes. And in my own country, Nigeria, in the northeast, due to violent attacks by Boko Haram and Islamic State in West Africa, we have over 2.5 million people displaced. They don't have a home. Their homes are destroyed and they are roaming. They are staying in temporary shelters. And then again, the issue of kidnapping and, all that insecurity keeps, occurring in so many regions. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about is the burden of governance on homelessness, because it is really, really driving homelessness. The high cost of governance, lack of accountability, and true democracy has actually taken its toll on the people. So people are not just left behind. People are pushed behind by bad governance coupled with very weak institutions. Africa must reduce the cost of governance and ensure that public resources are used for the welfare of its citizens, and also deal with political issues in a transparent and democratic way in order to reduce insecurity, political conflicts, and unrest that are pushing millions of people into homelessness. Yes, we need inclusive social policies to address this issue of homelessness, particularly among women. And if we must have a socially just future, then Africa and even other regions need to operate and implement inclusive social policies that will tackle those factors working against social inclusion, as well as pushing people into homelessness. When the principle of social justice, human rights, and dignity for all are observed and allowed to thrive, then inclusive social development will occur in our regions. So number one, we're talking about inclusive social housing policy. Yes, that has to be in place. I have to rush because of time. Then we're also talking about inclusive social policy on access to land and secure tenure. Yeah, because we know that a lot of women that are living in shanty towns, they don't have security of tenure. This also needs to be addressed. Then again, Africa and even other regions should think about inclusive economic empowerment policies that would, help to empower women and give them more money, for their efforts. Then the elephant in the room is the issue of equal participation in decision making. You find out that in so many countries, women occupy less than 35% of leadership positions. This is not just Africa, in so many other countries. This, again, has to be addressed. Then, when we talk about good practices and innovative solutions in addressing homelessness, the best and most sustainable solution to address homelessness is to prevent it ab initio from happening. And then, even when it occurs, it should be short-lived. There are a few countries, yes, that have shelters, like Ethiopia and a few other countries that have shelters for homeless people. So Africa should address these customary laws and practices that deny women the right to inheritance, land, and housing, and at the same time tackle poverty and end homelessness amongst women. Member states will need to increase the pool of affordable housing and address the arbitrary evictions and the commodification of housing. There is also the need to regulate rental and housing costs, including requirements to ensure that women and other vulnerable groups are able to, access rental properties. Then finally, multi-stakeholder cooperation and partnership is very, very key in whatever we do. Civil society must be represented. People with lived experience has to be represented. Member states and private sector, including development institutions, they should all be encouraged to work together to be able to design good policies and implement such policies and programs in order to tackle homelessness. Now, we are also pushing that homelessness must continue to be given an important place on the UN General Assembly agenda. We just heard, that the cooperatives are having next year, as their, what about homelessness, So we are saying that such things, should also be, that homelessness should also receive such international and global attention if we must effectively address homelessness. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Iffy. And like myself, Dr. Iffy is one of the founding members of the Working Group to End Homelessness. And you have given your voice to all the different areas of homelessness that we've been looking at over the last 5 years. And of course, one of the things you did say, and we know very well, in relation to homelessness and indeed in the African countries, is the lack of data. Because we can say the numbers we have, and we talk about these millions that are homeless and billions looking for adequate housing. But they're all numbers, but we need action, and this is what we've been talking about in these past few days. The definition, as you talked about, is always a problem in many countries, because every country can have its own description at the moment, because we don't have a definition of homelessness. But as you rightly said, that would really help to focus in on what we are talking about. I was particularly interested in the Maputo Protocol, which brought some achievement to the African country in relation to homelessness. But again, like any protocol, it's what happens on the ground. And as you said, achievements are still insufficient. And I think you pointed that out very well, Dr. Iffy, in relation to women and girls. I suppose one of the key things you keep saying, and I've heard it again this afternoon, is that homelessness is solvable. And all it needs is political will, and actually for governments to work together instead of working in silos, but that it is possible in some ways to break that cycle that isn't so big when we look at other crises. So I think that's really important. You called for a socially just future, and you are a very strong voice in relation to that, particularly for African women and girls. And I thank you for that presentation this afternoon, Dr. Iffy. And now I would like to turn to Ms. Shia Gopal, the Special Representative to the United Nations International Organization of Employers. Ms. Shia, you have the floor.
Thank you, distinguished panelists and excellencies and distinguished guests. I am speaking on behalf of the International Organization of Employers that represents 50 million companies in 150 different countries. But I'm also speaking on behalf of the Business and Industry Group, where I am the co-chair. Now, the advantage of being last on the panel is that I agree with so much which has already been said, and I will try not to repeat myself. But what Kathy said, and also Doug, we have so much in common, and we do work together, and that's how we can resolve some of our problems. I'd like to look at what are some of the bottlenecks, but what are some of the best practices in attaining social justice, but with really looking at increasing decent work and economic growth. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So IOE is the representative for employers at the ILO, and social justice is embedded in the ILO Constitution and the ILO Philadelphia Declaration. And Kathy and I just came from a side event. We were really celebrating the whole new initiative by ILO of the Global Coalition for Social Justice. Now, what really matters is if we really want social justice, as my colleagues have already said, we need an enabling environment for sustainable enterprises, and that includes SMEs, which are the backbone to most economies. We need a skills strategy. We need productive employment. Productivity is key, and I'll discuss the importance of AI. And then, of course, we must address informality, as many others have said, where we have one of the biggest issues, and it's increasing in many developing countries. But partnerships, social dialogue are key, and we're happy to see, as I said, the Global Coalition. Now, what is the private sector? Now, often when we think of the private sector, most people tend to think of only multinational corporations, which of course are very important. But SMEs, led by women in LDCs, youth startups, employers and business organizations are also the private sector and key. But I would like to focus on SMEs for a minute. 90% of all businesses are SMEs. 70% of global employment. In OECD countries, 99% of businesses are SMEs, and 2/3 of the jobs are from SMEs. SMEs are critical if we're going to be looking at job growth as we go forward. Decent work, we must say 90% of the jobs are created by the private sector. But as I said, we need an enabling environment. One of the biggest problems for SMEs today is the bureaucracy. If it takes 350 days to create an SME, most companies will remain in the informal sector. Governance, rule of law, corruption are critical. Taxation, how do we automate many of the rules and regulations, but also make it simpler for SMEs? A skills strategy is so critical. Human skills are the most important skills that we can have. But our technical skills, most employers are saying, will no longer be obsolete in 3 years' time. So we need to make sure that we're reskilling our workers to make sure that they can transition and we have a just transition for all workers. Productive employment, we must use AI, and we hear so much about that today, but productivity can increase. We will see jobs being easier. People are going to have time for creativity, etc. We will lose some jobs, particularly in the clerical areas in advanced economies. But AI will not take away your job. But the person with the skills, the AI skills will. And so we have an obligation, all of us, to work together on the education and reskilling of workers. Informality, as I said, is increasing, and we have some 2 billion people that we think we're counting in the informal sector. However, social dialogue is a win-win, and inclusive multilateralism is critical, and business must be at the table. Now, who are the key partners? I just quickly will go through employers' federations, business organizations that represent small, large, all different industries and sectors, international organizations for global dialogue, governments, union organizations, and social dialogue is how we get regulation, making sure it's balanced and representing all views. But UN organizations at the local level are critical, and resident coordinators. And to that end, I'd like to say that we were very proud to, during the Partnership Forum, to announce that we have launched a new playbook in trying to get employers' federations and resident coordinators to work together at the local level. But partnership is key. And of course, the Global Compact at the local level. But so how do we look at some of the partnerships and the day-to-day work? So I'd like to give a few examples. In Ghana, they have increased output. The private sector is working with some of the models that worked and implementing them in Ghana, particularly a Japanese model for manufacturing. The private sector and the Federation is working with the government in trying to digitalize a lot of the registration and regulation around setting up an SME. In Mexico, in a very remote area, the private sector, along with the Employers Federation, realized that children in a city, Oaxaca, 7 hours away from any major city, young people had education only for 6 years. And we know that that can be an impediment for 3 generations for people to move up the social ladder. So together, the private sector first gave them access to the internet. Second, gave them tablets. Third, gave them tutors and trainers and educators. And now these young people have access to education to the 12th grade. Lastly, I'd like to the next one was South Africa and Switzerland. Apprenticeships, internships, traineeships are public-private partnerships that work. And they're so critical for the reskilling of young people to ensure that they can have the jobs as we move into this transition to the new greener, bluer jobs. But Switzerland in particular has a model that works and is being duplicated in many other countries, the German model as well. That's how we have global solidarity, and we work together to make sure we're helping one another move, because there are many lessons learned and good lessons. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we can learn from others. And lastly, Microsoft, along with IOE, have a program to train young people on digital skills in DRC, Senegal, Uganda. So critical to ensure that young people have the skills that they need. So now, how do we bring this all together? I think it is critical that, as many of my colleagues have said, governance, rule of law, good legislation, implementable not just for large companies, but most importantly for SMEs. Social dialogue, partnership. We can move this all forward, but we need to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Gopal. That was a most interesting description that you've just given us of SMEs and the importance, I think what you said was in terms of partnerships and the key to looking at the SDGs. But of course, as you said, you're facing many challenges, but you also talked about your partnership here on the panel with both Doug and Kathy. And I think that's really important to recognise in what you've been talking about. And you talked about the celebrating of the ILO, the Global Coalition for Social Justice. And I suppose what you talked about, if we want to have enabling environments, we need to address the informality, where there's an increase in the informality sector, as you rightly described, and I think that's really important. And also the need for skilling and upskilling, because how things will change within the next 3 years, and that's not a long time. And again, you called for inclusive multilateralism, as many of us do, as a significant call to make the change, the paradigm shift that we're all talking about. I was interested in the different countries that you talked about and their experiences and how we can all learn from each other if we just kind of work in partnership with each other. And I was particularly interested in that example you gave us of Mexico. Particularly children are 7 hours away from education, but what the private partnership was able to do significantly by access to the internet, to tablets and tutors. So there you go. There was a good solution to what we were looking for. So thank you so much indeed, Ms. Cathy. So now the floor is open for interactive discussion, which we've been looking for this afternoon. So we take so many questions, and we'll invite the panelists to make comments after we hear some of the statements and questions. I'd like to invite delegations wishing to make comments and pose questions. Please press the microphone, and please keep to your time. Thank you very much. Where's the first one? So we're just looking at our list for speakers, and our first speaker is the Institute for Planetary Synthesis, and just for our friends here, it's NGO1. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I should like to thank the panel for their warmth and the constructive way in which you've looked at how we can work together with those who suffer from problems and also with our governments. The Institute for Planetary Synthesis is one of about 800 participants of the Commons Cluster, we are sisters, of course, with the cooperatives, who are our business arm. We're affiliated also with the UN NGO Major Group. Our objective is to bring best practices from the grassroots around the world and to make these available to all member states, and we have extensive mailing lists to do this. Before a UN conference relating to sustainable development, we put out a call to the grassroots and invite people with initiatives in that area to send them to us. They usually put them in a Google Doc, and then we bring these together in an order so that they build on one another and show how these grassroots initiatives actually build towards achieving the goals of that conference. We send it out very widely to all those associated with the UN member states. For us, the ongoing question is, every time again, how can we best present this work in a way that our member states and governments will and can best build on what we provide? And I'm talking to you as colleagues who also, I'm sure, have had ongoing communications, also written communications with member states. We'd love your advice. Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, also.
Thank you very much indeed to the Institute of Planetary Synthesis. And maybe we might get a response to the question. Thank you for your sharing about going to the grassroots. And grassroots people are very good at informing us of what's going on, and we need it here, very much so at the UN. But again, you said, how can we best present these practices both to our governments and member states? So maybe could I call on you, Doug, please? Thank you to answer that.
Thank you. And I think that's an excellent question and an excellent point, that if we, as a panel, the excellent examples of best practices and innovative solutions, it's very important for us to learn as stakeholders. But at the end of the day, we certainly want to impact the policies of the member states so that people can actually use some of the solutions that we're presenting. The question of how to best share the strategies and the examples, I think, is I have just a couple ideas. One is that it really does, I think, the most impactful, compelling messages to policymakers is a mixture of both qualitative and quantitative. There does, as was surfaced a number of times today, the importance of having good data. Good policymakers, they want to make decisions based on the real facts that are happening in their nation, around the world. If we can bring good data around the needs and the potential for change, that can be very compelling. But data itself, I do not think is enough. The policymakers need to understand and hear the stories of people on the ground, of how strategies would help people build cooperatives, or how it would help ensure that more people would have safe and affordable housing. So I think it's a mixture. The last thing I'd mention is, I guess it's sort of a basic fundamental thing about advocacy is the best advocates are people from the community where that policymaker represents. And even though perhaps people like us are in this room, we've honed our skills in advocacy or lobbying, at the end of the day, if somebody that's actually from that local community can tell that story about their local community and back it up with data, I think those are some impactful ways to communicate.
Thank you very much indeed, Doug. I think you described that well, how in terms of the qualitative and quantitative data, but of course it's not enough. We need to back that up with good policies and well-informed strategies to take that to a further step. Don't know whether anybody else on the panel. Okay, Kathy, thank you.
Sure, thanks so much. I think it's always important to involve, as Doug was saying, people most impacted. And as I'm sitting here talking about workers, one very concrete idea I would have is how are countries developing national strategies to actually have in-country listening sessions and bring people around the table. Most people in the world don't know about United Nations processes. It's very far removed. I mean, many of us are in national institutions, global institutions, or even further removed. And so it's a big year for the world, right? Democracy is up for grabs. A couple billion people are going to the polls. People are going to be debating these very important issues: homelessness, social protection, cooperatives. And so I think it's a great year to bring together both these local debates that will naturally be happening. People have a lot of concerns. And bringing people in. If we want to build trust in democratic institutions, whether locally, nationally, or globally, people need to feel like they have a stake in those institutions. So I guess a very concrete suggestion is, one, if these processes are going to be accessible to real people, then we need to, have some education about what they are, why they matter, and then each government needs to come up with a national process for getting real input from unions, civil society organizations, employers, so that they can then craft their positions coming back here. No one should be crafting a position just sitting in this room. None of us should be, right? We should all be bringing back the power of the people in our communities. So I think we have a real opportunity to sort of reinvigorate the United Nations by bringing people back in. And I think the people are missing. We talk a lot about SDGs and policies and processes, the social forum, the future work, the care economy, but those are real people with real stakes in our institutions.
That was a great response, Kathy. I really appreciate that, particularly the end about the power of the people and thinking of the charter, We the Peoples. And I think this is the year to take it back, because we are leading into 2025, as Doug talked about the cooperatives, and we also have the Summit for the Future and the World Social Summit. And we do, as you rightly said, we need education on the issues so that we can carry out our democratic rights. Thank you very much. Is there any other member of the panel that would like to speak? Thank you very much, Shia.
Yes, just very quickly. I think that you rightly said that you need to, and I think the other panelists have said this, we can be looking at the UN at the global level, and it's important that we discuss these in New York. But real action is not necessarily in New York, and that's why local, meaning the governments, each country is different. And we have found that the more you go into the country, the more that you realize that it depends on the industries, it depends on the geography. There are so many different parts to the equation. But just don't start at the federal or the government level. Go to cities. Go into the villages. Now, in line with this, it's one of the things that we have been frustrated with, because I think some people tend to think that the private sector will be able to resolve this problem. But the private sector very much wants to resolve a lot of these problems, and particularly the SDGs, and they're committed to this. But you do need to be at the table. And we're not looking at just financing, but innovation, technology. There are solutions to the SDGs. We could get back on track if we would only sort of sometimes be humble and look at some of the solutions that we already have. Now, one of the things that you raised, which I think is important in UN processes, there are plenty of meetings. We have plenty of those. But what about now during the HOPF, we have the voluntary national reviews. And they are supposed to include civil society, private sector, the workers, employers. And we need to make sure that we give the input, because often we hear that the SDGs from each government that they're doing really well. And then we say, but how is it that we're only meeting 12% of the targets? Real, true dialogue. But there's the cooperative frameworks in each country. There's the country analysis. These are UN processes where civil society, employers, workers should be at the table discussing these issues. But again, I think we can't wait to be called to the table. We need to initiate at the local level and trying to show our added value and how we have a common objective. We want to get there, but we know we need to do it together.
Thank you very much indeed, Shia. I think you rightly said there are solutions, and we know there are solutions, but we have a short time to get to the solutions. But we will do it if we do it together and break the silos, as you said, and making sure that everyone is included. Thank you very much indeed. The floor really is open to anyone who would like to ask a question or make a statement. Please press your button. Okay, thank you very much. So I will call on the panelists to make a final statement on this afternoon's subject, and maybe starting with Mr. Danilo Turk, please.
Thank you. Well, we had a very interesting set of insights and proposals from panelists, and I think the discussion also demonstrated the need for further innovation. Now, I would like to, in this concluding part, mention only one thing. The preparations for the second World Summit for Social Development is an opportunity. It is an opportunity for many things, including an opportunity to tell stories about innovative solutions and successes that exist. And I think that is really something that needs to be given special attention. Now, the summit will be an intergovernmental meeting, and it would be a mistake if that was understood as meaning that the whole process is limited to diplomatic negotiations, final document, things like this. No, it is much more. It is an opportunity to bring the questions of social development much higher up in the attention of general public. And I think that opportunity should be used. The preparations for the World Social Summit will start soon. There will be a need for a General Assembly resolution and certain technical things that the UN usually does. But there will also be a need to answer the question, how does one bring the summit, the idea of the summit, closer to the people? What does one do? UN has some instruments in that regard. UN as an institution, country teams, and some of that was mentioned. Country teams, I would add, regional commissions and so forth. So there are certain mechanisms which are there and which will have to be engaged. But again, the question of multi-stakeholder approach to this part of the task becomes very interesting. Are the potential stakeholders for a World Summit for Social Development sufficiently aware of the opportunity? Are they sufficiently motivated to use it? Are they thinking about how to engage all the technological tools for that to happen? Of course, I have no answers to this, but what I would like to mention, our time requires that UN is brought closer to the people, and all the panelists have spoken about that. And obviously, when the UN is preparing a major meeting on social development, something that has a very ambitious title and very ambitious political vision, then of course the contents, such as the one that we heard about during this panel, has to be brought to the general public. There has to be a bigger debate. There has to be something that would make the process meaningful. We are now at the very beginning, and the opportunity is here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Turk, and thank you too for your support in regard to the World Social Summit and its preparation. And as you've been saying, not just today, but on Monday, we can all get involved in this. It is an opportunity for us to do something about the questions that matter to us. And as Kathy said earlier, and educating ourselves on what are the issues and the issues that will come to the floor for the World Social Summit. And again, it's about we the people. And if we keep that in mind, then we'll be able to go to the World Summit educated on what needs to be heard from civil society. The NGO CSocD have been making many mission visits in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And for us, it was important to talk about the World Social Summit and how we can sit around the table and engage with each other in preparation for this. And as our friend said earlier, and how we present the grassroots. So thank you very much indeed. Could I go next to Dr. Iffy, please?
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. I just want to highlight that in many communities in Africa, women, whether they are married or widowed, once they do not have a male child, then they tend to lose their land, their right to land, to housing and property, because their relatives, take over, those assets. And the reason is that land is owned by families and communities. So once a woman does not have a male child, whatever land she's been farming on or that she's been using is taken over once her husband is dead. And the funny thing is that I remember the Commission on the Status of Women 66th session, quietly mentioned the issue of women's right to land. We really have to enforce this. Member states have to visit this. Because when women do not have the right to land, once their property is taken over, they are on the streets. So that's number one. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is that poverty, yes, affects everybody. But I have heard it in circles that poverty has the face of a woman. So what does that tell you? That if we must eradicate poverty, we must deal with gender inequality. We have to focus on empowering women. As long as women are not empowered, as long as women suffer from inequality, we're just wasting our time. There's no way we can eradicate poverty. So I just wanted to point that one out. And then finally, I remember, that the SG's report, talked about, 783 million people living, in extreme poverty. In fact, more than that now. And he also did mention in his remarks, I noted it, in one high-level meeting on gender equality and women's empowerment in Africa that was held in Addis Ababa, that despite the gains, poverty still has a woman's face. So what does that tell us? That in whatever we do, we really need to draw our attention and focus on empowering women. And once, we're able to do that, the issue of poverty, the issue of homelessness will be adequately addressed. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Iffy, and for your continued voice in relation to women's right to land. And we had a very good discussion on this the other day. And I think that discussion just has to continue in order to deal with this inequality that still exists. And again, that, as you've been rightly saying, that poverty has the face of a woman. We have to change that. And so you are leading us in that way, and I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'd like now to call on Mr. Doug O'Brien to give some final comments, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you again to the Commission for the opportunity to share the cooperative's role in addressing social development goals. The title of this panel was, or is, good practices and innovative solutions, and it strikes me that in the challenges that were surfaced in the conversation today, the excellent conversation today, that cooperatives definitely have a role, and not only they are a good practice, they're a best practice. They're known. We mentioned that 1 billion people across the world are members of cooperatives. They've gone to scale. There is a lot of literature showing how cooperatives work in good governance. And as we look for solutions and strategies, it is a place that there's a wealth of information and examples, and from every corner of the world, from India to Kenya to here in the United States and beyond. As far as an innovative solution, maybe there's some tension on a best practice and an innovative solution, because best practice would seem to be something in the past. Innovative solution would be something in the future. I'd submit that cooperatives have an absolute role as an innovative solution, because the world is not the same as it was. We talked about the challenges around democratic institutions, around the environment, around gender equality. We need to bring the very best, and we need to innovate those solutions. We need to bring in, from my perspective, businesses that are owned and controlled and benefit the people who use the business, as opposed to perhaps outside investors. Bringing that to places where that approach is not as common. That's an innovative solution. The use of technology within the democratic governance, ownership, and model of a cooperative. Those are innovative solutions that we need to bring to the fore. And that I think I'd end by I think echoing a theme that has come up a number of times today, is that the best voice on these innovative solutions and best practices are the people who actually use them in the local communities from across the world. And I'm looking forward, as a member of the cooperative community, to partnering with the UN in bringing those local voices in 2025 in the International Year of the Cooperatives. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much indeed, Doug. And I think what you've talked to us this afternoon was really the significant role of cooperatives. And it's very believable. And they're groups with good practices, as you said. And good practices has led to the good innovative solutions, because it's almost like that stepping stone. And I think that's really been important. And as I said to you earlier on, what's really important and makes it a good foundation for your organisation is the value-led organisation. And I think that's really important, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much indeed. And so now I go to Kathy Feingold for your final reactions, please.
Thanks so much. Maybe I'll end with some concrete ideas for the social forum, because I understand we're a little bit behind getting it together. So maybe some ideas. First, you're not going to be shocked. I think we should put issues that matter to this base we're talking about, which I think is included in the new social contract and includes gender equity and all of the issues that were raised here. So making sure that the decent work agenda and social justice are at the center of all UN processes. Imagine if you're a local person. There is the UN Commission on Social Development, the High-Level Political Forum, the UN Summit of the Future. There are a lot of processes. Let's make it concrete. Why are these processes relevant? Well, because they're supposed to be solving the poly-crises that working people, poor people are facing around the world. Can we come up with, an educational piece or narrative for this coming year about the power of multilateralism? The UN is here to deal with these huge social crises that real people are facing. And what does that look like? A few very concrete ideas. Develop a template for member states to use on how to engage, whether it's the co-op or homeless people, informal economy, domestic workers. Have listening sessions, and then how do you feed back that information into the process? So really concrete tools that member states can have to prepare for the World Social Summit. And I think, again, we have the UN Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions. I'm not trying to, there's just so many processes here, but they all come down to some core tenets, which I do believe is part of the framework I laid out around building a social contract. We have innovation solutions, whether it's co-ops or advocacy around gender equality. You need a framework. And you need to say that you're delivering for real people a new social contract or something that will improve their lives and livelihoods. So that would be one just very concrete idea. And then as my colleague from the business community mentioned, we are working together with the International Labor Organization to support another initiative, which is the Global Coalition on Social Justice. And I think that is so important to bring the role of the ILO into the core of all of these processes we're discussing today, because it is the only UN institution that's tripartite, where you already have social dialogue. You have employers, unions, governments already sitting together to create standards to advocate for decent work. So that should be a key component of the coming years ahead with these processes. So I do hope and encourage the member states to really think about how we don't just sit here and create more processes, but we actually create frameworks for action. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Kathy. And I think we get your passion about what's needed as a way forward. And I think, again, I'm saying this is the year that we can do it. And as you rightly said, to create a narrative, particularly around multilateralism. And I feel it's the year we will have a listening ear. And that's what my experience has been. And I just think we need to continue that instead of just looking to meet the member states, just leading up to this forum, but that it's a continuing conversation. Thank you very much indeed. Now I'd like to give the floor to Gio for your final comments.
Well, thank you, and Madam Chair, and to all my colleagues, and I couldn't agree with all of you. Yes, yes, yes. But just in closing, I think we've identified that there are many challenges, but there are opportunities. And I tend to be a person who tends to think that the glass is full. Half full. I think data, technology, and the use of innovative ideas that are already out there will be key. I stress AI. I know many people are concerned about this, but it is the human who is using this, and we have to make sure that we use it for good. And there is a lot of good that can be done. Second, like Kathy, I would say jobs, jobs, and more jobs. UNDP did a recent study. Out of 96 countries, 73% said that to eliminate or eradicate poverty, you need jobs. Create a job, you feed a family. In order to leave no one behind, I think central is decent work and jobs. Lastly, I would say inclusive multilateralism. We say this and it sounds nice, but it really does mean that if we're at the UN, we have to be inclusive of all the various parties and not just member states, but civil society and all the various groups. Everyone should have a word. But I think this needs to be built on trust. And this is sometimes one of the things that I think we forget about, and we need to remind ourselves that we must trust one another and listen, and seriously listen to one another, and not just sort of keep the dialogue going, but really trying to understand the other group's views and vision, because that's where the solutions come from. And I'd just like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Shia. And I think we've got we had a wonderful panelist this afternoon from Mr. Danilo Turk, who giving us permission and opportunity to get involved in the World Social Summit. Mr. Doug O'Brien, A Way Forward for Innovative Solutions and Partnerships, which is exactly what we're talking about. Dr. Iffy, who passionately talks about a way forward out of homelessness, which is solvable. And Kathy, I think, is going to present us with some educational tools. We look forward to getting them, Kathy. You should not share something like that unless you're able to do it. And thank you to Shia for just your conversation to end with multilateralism and how it needs to be inclusive, and everybody should have a place at the table. And particularly, you said it's built on trust. It's also built on partnerships because they go hand in hand. So I think that's really important. So I'd like to thank all my panelists. It's been just a joy to be with you all. And it's now my pleasure to go back to our chair. Thank you.
Hemos llegado al final.
We have reached the end of an interesting multi-stakeholder forum on the priority theme. And I thank Ms. Quinn for guiding our discussion. I also thank our panelists and delegations for their participation and contribution. The Commission has thus concluded its programme of work for this meeting. On Monday, the 12th of February at 10 a.m., the Commission will begin its consideration of Agenda Item 4, Programme Questions and Other Matters, and its sub-items A and B. Following consideration and conclusion of Agenda Item 4 as a whole, the Commission will continue its general discussion of sub-items A and B of Agenda Item 3. The meeting is adjourned.